webinar series. So I'm your host today. I'm Ben Spradling, and I am really excited about today's topic, HR outsourcing for your small business. Is it for you? I'll introduce you to our expert speaker in just a moment, but before I do, I want to go over some housekeeping items for those who may be joining us for the very first time. Resources like today's webinars, those are made possible by BBB accredited businesses. Those are businesses that have taken a pledge to act with integrity and uphold our BBB 8 standards for trust. We really want to thank them today for their dedication to furthering BBB's vision of creating a marketplace where buyers and sellers trust each other. I also want to remind you that these webinars are available on our YouTube channel. You can find the link to that channel in the chat box. That can be accessed by selecting the chat button at the bottom of your screen. And since you're looking at the chat button already, find the Q&A button that's located right next to it. During today's presentation, you have an opportunity to ask questions. Submit those in the Q&A box at any time, and we'll reserve the last 10 minutes or so to answer them. You also have the ability to upvote any questions that are relevant to you. Please don't hesitate to look at other questions being asked. We will be asking questions based on the number of upvotes they receive. So with all that taken care of, I am really excited to introduce you to today's speaker. Krisann Hatch has been with Archbright for 6 years and now serves as the organization's Director of Workplace Innovation. She works with companies to strategize, innovate, and implement HR solutions, deliver employee development training, and provide advice, consultation, and support on a wide range of HR issues. She also plays a pivotal role in the development of new services for Archbright members. Prior to joining Archbright, Krisann spent nearly 25 years at all levels of human resources with Red Lion Hotels, including being their Senior Vice President of Human Resources from 2002 through 2013. Krisann has an undergraduate degree in business administration from Eastern Washington University, an MBA from Washington State University, and is a certified senior professional in human resources. Krisann, thank you again for joining us today. And without any further delay, I will turn the stage over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you for that introduction. So yes, my name is Krisann Hatch, and just wanted to give you just a little bit of understanding of one, who I work for, and my background and how it lends itself to this presentation. So I am with a company called Archbright, and as it says on the screen there, we are basically workplace performance experts. Through membership, organizations throughout Washington, Oregon, and Idaho can access our services. And in essence, we provide HR expertise, advice, employment law expertise, and then also safety, workers' comp, and loss prevention to our members. And so we are, in essence, a potential HR outsource for organizations. I'll use some information along the way of how we do that, things that we have outsourced internally at Archbright, kind of as I go along. And then also, as Ben mentioned, I was with Red Lion Hotels. So I also draw a lot of my experience from Red Lion Hotels. Fantastic career I had with Red Lion Hotels. And the cool thing about that experience is I often say I was on both sides of the HR kind of coin, if you will. For many years, I was an HR director at hotels, from small hotels to large hotels. I think I was at 7 different hotels throughout my career. And then I became a regional HR director. And then I had the opportunity to work in the corporate office and become the Senior Vice President of HR. And so I not only, when I was a property HR director, I would deliver and facilitate whatever was created by the corporate office. And then when I was at the corporate office, I was responsible for creating all the programs and disseminating that amongst all of our hotels. And so when I was in that role, of course, I was the one responsible for a lot of the whatever outsourcing relationships that we had. So as we go along, I'll draw from both my Red Lion experience as well as my Archbright experience to kind of share some stories as it relates to what to outsource, what not to outsource, what worked for us, what might work for you as we go along here. I'm imagining that many of you are joining this call because you're a small business and maybe you don't have an HR department at all. Maybe you have a very small one-person HR department. Maybe you have somebody in your organization that wears multiple hats. Might even be a few of you on the call that are a larger organization that has an HR department, but you're looking for HR expertise or maybe a specialty type of outsourcing situation. And I think any of those that I just described will get some benefit out of the presentation today. Determining what to outsource really boils down to identifying which tasks HR really needs to focus on. Those tasks that can effectively advance your strategic and your company's mission, and delegating the rest to a trusted outside third-party service provider vendor. Besides giving in-house HR professionals more time and opportunity to focus on those key initiatives, the strategic mission of the company, outsourcing can also really help provide organizations with specialized HR expertise. An example of that might be an affirmative action plan or training that no one in-house knows how to do, for example. Outsourcing can also help with regulatory compliance. I'll speak to that in a little bit greater detail in a little bit. And another thing outsourcing can really do for an organization is speed up response times and transactional HR functions, things like benefits enrollment and payroll. So I'll kind of speak to that as we go along as well. So in essence, I'm going to cover really kind of 4 nuggets throughout the presentation this afternoon. 1, what does HR really do? Yes, we do a lot, for the record, but I'm going to go through a list. It's not necessarily an all-inclusive list, but it covers the majority of what HR in most organizations could and may be responsible for. And then we're going to talk about what are the most commonly outsourced HR functions. Talk a little bit about that. Flip the coin, talk a little bit about what are the most commonly things kept in-house that we maybe don't want to outsource. And by the way, those 2 lists are going to be different for everybody. I'll speak to that a little bit as we go along. And at the end, I'm going to leave you with basically an action plan or a strategy that you can utilize with your organization to determine what makes sense for you. And what should you be outsourcing and considering, and what you need to think about as you're going through that process. So let's take a look at what does HR really do. Generally speaking, I think most of us on the call probably know HR deals with anything in your organization having to do with people, right? From hiring to firing and everything in between. However, the mindset that HR has to do everything can result in the HR department or the person or the function managing a lot of tasks that take time and energy away from HR activities that are more important to your company's mission and the strategic value to your company that HR can provide. It can also mean that the HR department is doing a lot of things only marginally well and not really doing anything really well. I think the term stretch too thin comes to mind. I've seen that happen in a lot of the HR function in organizations. They're trying to do everything when some of those functions probably could be outsourced and oftentimes at a cost savings. So again, like I said, this list isn't necessarily all inclusive, but it'll give you a really good sense of at least set the stage for the functions that we're talking about, whether you want to outsource it or keep it in-house. So let's kind of plug through this. Benefits administration, common one that HR is responsible for. Sometimes accounting and or payroll might be responsible for that. And while it's one little bullet point there, the list of things that falls under benefits administration is huge. And the larger your company gets and the more benefits you offer to your folks, the longer that list can get. Leave management and administration, same thing with all of the leave laws now that we have out there. This leave management is really becoming an onerous responsibility for any organization. And again, the larger you get, the more of these you're going to have, et cetera. But that's a big nugget too, that, and quite frankly, could be outsourced fairly easily. Compensation, and there's a handful of things that can fall under compensation, right? The design of it, the development, the delivery and or implementation, market pricing, salary surveys, all sorts of things can fall under compensation and how you design it within your organization. Diversity, equity, inclusion. This often falls under the HR department. Some companies do have a separate diversity department and or leader that can manage this, but a lot of times it does fall under the function of HR. Employee relations, commonly in the HR department, everything from conflict resolution, discipline, in write-ups, warnings, attendance, all of those types of things, and many more can fall into that employee relations bucket. Rewards and recognition kind of goes hand in hand. Of course, it's dealing with your people, so often falls in the HR. Labor relations. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, oh, that doesn't apply to me because we don't have a union. Doesn't really matter if you have a union or not, you still may have some labor relations. One, if you want to remain union free, well, that's a labor relations issue. And if you were ever union wanted to come into your organization, you would definitely need labor relations. And in addition, the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB, that kind of governs, if you will, labor relations. There's a lot of things that come from the NLRB that all companies are required to do or follow from their guidance. So when you hear labor relations, don't necessarily count it out. There might be some things within that that apply to you, whether you're union or non-union. Organizational development, things like your structure, your leadership, your talent assessment, succession planning, how you divide up your divisions and your departments and things of that nature typically will fall under the HR arena. Employee development, leadership development, those types of things can fall under HR. Of course, talent acquisition. And again, three little bullets that I have here, but that whole talent acquisition is often a department in and of itself. And right now with the labor market that we're experiencing, it's particularly challenging, but recruiting, hiring, onboarding, all of that can fall under that talent acquisition aspect of HR. And then technology and whatever systems you use, human resource information system, that's what HRIS stands for. That can certainly be within HR's functions. Compliance, again, everything on this list almost could have a compliance aspect to it, right? But particularly employment law, state laws, local laws, federal laws, leave management laws, benefits administration. I mean, compliance alone is a huge responsibility. You're going to see me talk about that as one that, even though it is probably a key initiative for you to be compliant, it also might need to be something that you outsource or could consider outsourcing, just because it's so hard to keep up with all of it. Affirmative action, that's typically for federal contractors or subcontractors at certain levels are required to have an affirmative action plan. But some organizations, even that aren't federal contractors, may voluntarily choose to have an affirmative action plan. Learning and development, training, the employee development I mentioned there, personal development, leadership development, etc. Performance management, whatever you might do for that, whether it's an annual performance review, whether it's a coaching process that you do, falls under performance management, typically it falls within HR. Strategic planning. I know I did a fair amount of this when I was with Red Lion. I know I was at a fairly senior level, but hopefully HR in some regards is part of your strategic planning. It should be, seeing as it has to do with your people, pretty important function. Of course, the administration, which can be everything from records retention, policies, procedures, handbooks, managing any self-service applications, managing just all the processes associated with everything on this list. So that's a really long list. A lot of really important functions that most organizations have to deal with. And in some companies, maybe all of these functions are handled internally, but not very often, right? For example, when I was with Red Lion, at our height, we had about 50 hotels and 4,000 employees. We handled a lot of those functions internally, but we also outsourced a lot. And I'll share some examples of what we kept in-house and what we outsourced as we go along through the presentation. So the list you see on your screen now gives you a really good sense of the types of functions within HR that are commonly outsourced. Examples up there: temporary staffing, some of your recruiting, high volume recruiting, benefits administration and payroll. Very common that either all of it or aspects of those are outsourced. Things like leadership development. I mentioned affirmative action plans. Some of these functions in some companies may never be outsourced, right? Even though these are the list of commonly outsourced items, some companies may not outsource any of these. An example would be that leadership development that I just said. In some companies, it would likely be a key HR initiative, and they have the internal expertise in order to handle it. But in another company, while leadership development may be a key HR initiative, and I would personally argue that in every company it should be, right? But maybe they don't have the internal expertise or the bandwidth to handle that function, and therefore would look outside of the company in order to find a trusted partner that could help them with leadership development. Another example, when I was Red Lion, as I was talking about affirmative action plans. So each of our hotels had to have an affirmative action plan because we were considered federal. Most of our hotels were considered federal contractors because federal, state businesses or agencies, would use our meeting space and stay in our hotel, and that's a contract, right? And so you have to be at a certain threshold. You have to have 50 employees, and I think the threshold is $10,000. Don't quote me on that. Might have changed. I might be off there by 10,000 or so, but anyway, so each of our hotels had to have many of our hotels had to have an affirmative action plan. And so for the most part, we kept that in-house. We trained our HR directors on how to do that. And we had a lot of processes in place, did a lot of hard work to give them their tools in order to do that at each hotel. However, if a hotel received an audit for their affirmative action plan notice from the federal government called the OFCCP, then we had an outside firm that a trusted partner that we had swoop into the hotel and help them through that audit so that we could have a successful audit. So just as an example. Compensation is another one. You're going to see it on both lists: commonly outsourced, commonly kept in-house. It just depends on your organization, right? It can be handled some might want to keep it completely in-house. Others might say, we need help. We don't have that expertise. We need to hire someone to design it, to develop it, help us with market pricing. Archbright does all of that. For example, we do market pricing for our members. We have one of the largest wage surveys in Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. And so a lot of companies utilize that because they don't have the internal expertise or bandwidth to do it. And again, I shared this list not because these are the things that you should outsource, but rather just as some examples of functions that are commonly outsourced. So now we're going to talk about what is typically handled in-house. And you, like I said, you may notice some things are on the list again. So here's a list of things that are typically kept in-house. And for example, I mentioned compensation as an example. You might be going, wait a minute, Krisann, you have the same thing on two lists. Well, that's done intentionally because some organizations might outsource this, some might keep it in-house. It all depends on each organization's culture, each organization's key HR initiatives, what your internal expertise and bandwidth is, and a whole host of other organizational considerations. But some of these, because of the intricacy of them, the need to really know the employees and the inner workings of an organization, make more sense to keep in-house. Employee relations is the first most obvious one that comes to mind. It's pretty difficult unless you know all the players and you know what's going on to conduct discipline with somebody. So that employee relations is usually kept in-house. Compensation, while you may have someone externally maybe design and develop your compensation program, typically the delivery and implementation is going to be handled internally. Talent development, again, just because a lot of companies like to keep that because you know the employees, you know your organizational structure, you know what you're trying to achieve, often kept in-house. Same thing kind of with succession planning. Capital strategy planning is hard to do externally because, again, you got to know your budget, what you have to work with, the things you've done in the past, what you're doing in the future. Performance management, kind of along the same lines, to managing the HR department itself. So again, just a kind of a quick down and dirty list of some typical HR functions that are kept in-house. So now that we've reviewed and kind of set the stage for what HR does, the big long list that I started with, what is commonly outsourced, what's commonly or typically kept in-house, how do you decide for your organization? So what I've done is I've created just kind of a quick 4-step strategy or action plan that you can use in your organization to help you determine, of that big long list, you know, what should we outsource? And that's the goal of this. But before I get into it, I would offer some advice that before you start into any sort of strategy or action plan like this, you need to determine within your company who owns this process. As with any initiative at all, inside, outside of HR, I don't care what the initiative is, if someone doesn't own it and champion it, it will fail. So pause, figure out who is it in your company that has the bandwidth, has at least enough expertise to take on not only this strategy, but then also they would likely be the same person that would manage any vendors or third-party relationships that you end up developing as a result of working through this little action plan or strategy. So let's start with step one. Step one is identifying and prioritizing your key HR initiatives. I kind of hinted at that earlier, right? But it's really important for HR in this situation to let go a little bit of that need to be all things to all people, right? Let me give you an example. When I was an HR director with Red Lion, when I first started, I knew nothing, so everything terrified me. But as I, did it more and more, of course, you gain experience, and I got to a point where I was really good with things like unemployment claims, workers' compensation claims, things like that. And as we got bigger at one point, we decided, the greater Red Lion organization, that we were going to outsource unemployment. And I was devastated. I'm like, oh, what? No one is going to be able to do this as well as I can do it internally because I know exactly what's going on. I had to let go of that, right? Because while unemployment, I'm not suggesting unemployment is not an important aspect or a task to be handled, but is it driving your company's mission or strategic vision? Probably not, right? So outsourcing it to a very competent, capable company that can handle those and keep your costs down probably makes a lot of sense. It hurt my heart to get rid of it, but I got over it. So again, back to identifying and prioritizing, you've got to define what is HR's strategic role in your company. That's a key aspect of this first step. Focus on how HR drives your overall mission. What is your mission? What is your strategy? What's your long-term vision? And where does the people aspect play into that? That can help you start to be thinking about, okay, what are the key initiatives? I can't imagine that recruitment, retention, keeping good people, talent development, right? Grooming people to take on leadership positions within your organization, take on greater responsibility, all of those, I would imagine, and many, many more. Keeping costs down. So your benefits administration, I would imagine that's could potentially be part of an overall mission and strategy. And then decide what HR tasks are special to your company and important to your culture, because that's going to be different for everybody, right? Now, if you currently conduct some sort of annual strategic planning process, this could definitely and should be just a part of that process and could easily be folded into that. You may already be doing this. I don't know. But I find most of our members don't do a lot of this type of planning. So, and if you don't, you probably should. And then once you have identified your HR initiatives that are critical to your mission and or unique to your organization, you'll then need to prioritize that list. And again, if you have a strategic planning process, it can be part of that process. And how you prioritize can really be unique to you also. It might be as simple as speaking to the entire leadership team and coming to a census on what you believe to be the priorities of those HR initiatives that you've determined you have in your company. All right, step two. Step two is all about conducting kind of a current state assessment of what you have in your organization. So questions that you would want to ask in this step are things like, who does what currently in-house as it relates to all those HR functions that we talked about earlier? What expertise do we have in-house? What expertise is missing that we need? What isn't being done at all that needs to be done? That'd be a good thing to think about. I would imagine there might have been a few of you on the call that when I went through that original list of what HR does, there might have been a few things on that list that you're like, we don't do that at all. We probably should. So that might be something that, might go on to this assessment. What is being done that is really time consuming, but not lending itself to the priorities that you identified earlier in step one? That's something to think about. And then after you answer a lot of those questions, what are the gaps? Where is that expertise missing? Where are the gaps within what you've identified within your current state? So once you've done step 1 and 2, where you've identified your key HR initiatives and you've done a current state assessment, and depending on the size of your company, those 2 steps could have been done fairly quickly. Now, if you're a larger company, it might take a little bit more time to go through those steps. But once you've done those, you then need to start thinking about, okay, what functions can and or should be outsourced? The goal here is to determine where outside expertise is needed and or HR time needs to be freed up with some of those more task-oriented functions that are time-consuming but not lending themselves to the critical mission of the company. That's what you want to be thinking about when you're thinking about the functions that could or should be outsourced. Any roles HR is currently managing that kind of fall outside those sweet spots that you identified in step 1 could be considered for outsourcing. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to end up to be outsourced or that it has to be, but it could at least go on the list for consideration. So remember the list that we reviewed earlier of the most commonly outsourced functions. There's a lot of them, right? And that's not to say the things on that list aren't important to the operation of the company. Things like maybe drug testing or background screening, maybe, temporary staffing. I don't know, it's important. We have a lot of our manufacturing members that do a lot of temporary staffing, and it is absolutely key to keeping things running. But it could also be done very efficiently, effectively, and oftentimes more so by an outside party because it just doesn't drive the strategic mission of the organization. So keep some of those things in mind as you're working through step 3. And even some critical functions. Let me take the example of, remember I had that list of regulatory compliance could be considered for outsourcing. HR compliance alone, and that's not to mention all the other compliance issues you probably have in your company. So I told you I was just on a scoping call earlier this morning with a nursing organization, and it's home health care. So they're out and about 120 nurses that are out and about. And we got to talking about the thing we were talking about was important a little while ago. Well, of course, everything has shifted because now all of their nurses have to obtain the vaccine. And so their world has been upended again, and their regulatory compliance completely outside of HR is huge. And so I would imagine that could be the case in your company as well. With regards to this presentation, I'm just talking about HR regulatory compliance, employment law issues, local laws, federal laws, state laws, leave laws, benefit, all those things that fall under the HR compliance umbrella requires constant attention to stay up to date on the latest regulations, the legal decisions, the case law, that kind of stuff. Most HR departments don't have that kind of expertise or that time. So even though regulatory compliance within the HR function is a critical function for your organization, it still might make sense to be on this list of something to be considered for outsourcing. And then let's move to step 4. Step 4, once you've done the previous 3 and you determined what your list of potential functions to be outsourced, well, now it's time to find out who's out there that can do this, that can do it well and be a trusted partner. You need to do your homework, and you need to find out, who is available out there, what do they do they meet your needs? You can still maintain control of really important HR functions and help HR become that more efficient, effective player in your organization. You just need to find the trusted partners to do this. So you need to compare the benefits that each of them offers, compare the costs. What are the approaches that these different firms might offer or have for whatever function it is that you're considering outsourcing? I actually have another slide that we'll walk through here in a minute, the next one after this one, that gives you some criteria to use when considering who you might want to bring on as a trusted partner. Be sure the Better Business Bureau accredits the firm. Talk to other companies that have used the firm. That's one of the best things you can do, because then you can really learn, how was it from the beginning? Did they do what they said they were going to do? I can't tell you how many times I was with a vendor, asked all the right questions, at least I felt I did. And then once we hired them, so to speak, or signed an agreement or a contract with them, and found out they didn't really do what we thought they were going to do. So references can really help with that, because you can find out the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? What have you loved about it? What have you not liked so much? Did they deliver on their promises? So I really recommend not only doing your homework, whether you're Googling or however you're searching for possible providers, but ask them for a list of references, and or even a better way to do it, because of course they're probably going to give you a list of the companies that love them. That's what I would probably do, right? It might be better to even put out there yourself, hey, like on LinkedIn, hey colleagues, who's used Archbright before, what do you think of them? Glassdoor is out there where you can learn a lot about Better Business Bureau. You can learn a lot about organizations. So my whole point with all that, do your homework. And then lastly, with regards, when you do decide to utilize a third-party vendor, provider, fully understand that agreement or contract and the value you will receive in doing business with that particular service provider. And don't be afraid to kind of go slowly through that process, ask a lot of questions, and make sure you fully understand it. And don't be afraid to ask if they aren't providing what you wanted. You'd be surprised how many will be very flexible. So don't be afraid to ask. As I always say, the worst they could do is say no, right? All right, so there's a strategy for you. I wanted to offer up, as I mentioned, here's just a really great list that you could use when you are doing that step 4 in finding what type of service providers are out there. What is their level of expertise? What is exactly that they are doing? What is their reputation? And again, that's back to checking with references, Glassdoor, Better Business Bureau, etc. Ease of use. How easy are they to use? That's a big one. I can't tell you how many times we switched payroll and HRIS numerous times in my 25-year career with Red Lion. And of course, they're going to tell you that it's easy to use, but there was many times where once we actually got it in-house and were using it and found not so easy to use, or things that should have been easy to do weren't so easy to do, or I didn't do it at all, things like that. So not only participate in the demos, but go beyond that and find out, how easy is it truly to use? What sort of on-site assistance do they provide? Are there any a la carte offerings that could enhance what they're offering you? Make sure, is it a long-term commitment? That's a tricky one, because if it doesn't work out the way you wanted it to, then you're stuck. So be a little cautious about long-term contracts required. What type of support materials do they provide? Is there pricing transparency? Big one. Flexibility and customization. I'm going to use an example here in a few minutes of a software as a service that we use. We use it at Archbright internally, and we also offer it to our members. That's really cool. And one of the things I love about them the most is they have been so flexible, and they listen to you. And if what you want them to do makes sense, they're like, I think maybe we need to do that. So I'll share that here in just a minute. And customization, are they willing to customize? Because very rarely are any two companies alike. So that customization feature, make sure you understand what they're willing to do and not do. And if it's important to your operation and your organization, do they offer a mobile app, a web platform, whatever might make sense, depending on whatever it is that you're looking into using. So that criteria can be helpful for you when you're doing that step 4 and doing your homework. All right, really the last slide I have before I give you some references and then open it up to Q&A is, what are some of the types of options out there? While some companies may entrust their HR needs to a single outside firm, I don't see that happen very often. I've never done that. It's more common to parcel out functions to a range of different service providers. Like when I was with Red Lion, as I mentioned, that list that I gave you early on at the beginning of the presentation, we really did a lot of that in-house. And we grew our HR department at the corporate office to where we had a lot of expertise internally. But that said, I also managed a ton of third-party providers, everything from, I mentioned, HRIS, payroll, learning management systems, applicant tracking systems, of course, benefit brokers, and all the individual benefit providers. As I mentioned, affirmative action plan experts, used a lot of different leadership development consultants over time. Some training, we did a lot of our training in-house, but some training we did outsource, unemployment, as I mentioned, and there's probably a dozen more that I've forgotten by now. But even as much as we did in-house, still had a ton of third-party providers as well. So the list here, I think I've got 4 or 5 things on here, are the different types, and these are kind of big buckets, just to kind of give you a sense of options that are out there. So SaaS is software as a service, software licensing and delivery model. This can give your organization greater agility, often gives opportunity for cost savings. Examples of software could be like HRISs, talent management systems, applicant tracking systems, training, performance management. The one I wanted to share that we found, and it was an individual that I work with, found it at an HR technology conference back in 2019. The company is called 15Five, and it's a platform, so it is a software. However, for what it did for us internally is it took about, I don't know, probably 6 or 7 different functions, things that we do at Archbright, and we had that many different platforms and passwords and everything else we had to use, put it all under one umbrella. 15Five is basically a communication and engagement platform. I'll say that just high level, but what it has within it is the ability to have one-on-ones with your direct reports and keep a list of the things you want to talk about in the one-on-one. Employees do a weekly check-in. We do we don't do performance reviews. We do coaching. It's called catalytic coaching. We do that now within 15Five. We follow the traction. If you've ever heard of the book Traction, the traction methodology of objectives and goal achievement. They're called rocks or objectives. 15Five handles that for us. It handles our engagement survey internally. It handles our recognition program. We have a set of values that are very important to us internally at Archbright, and we have a recognition program relative to how people behave and use those values internally. 15-5 handles that. It's called high fives. Super cool way to appreciate each other in the company. So I just use that as an example, but that's a software that we found that we were able to outsource and use, and really has been almost life-changing for us at Archbright internally. And then we do offer that 15-5 actually to members too. The next one there is BPO, business process outsourcing. This is if you wanted to outsource a single business task, like payroll, to a third-party provider. Other examples might be business administration, COBRA administration, unemployment administration, that type of thing. Just a single business process. Now, some third-party providers might do a bunch of those all under one, and you'll see some of that in a couple of these options too. So the next one, single source outsourcing. This is accessing one solution to kind of meet all your needs. A single supplier really covers the full, what we call the employee life cycle, hiring to firing. This type of human capital management technology starts with talent acquisition all the way through like time and labor management. Payroll might cover talent management, might cover I think I mentioned talent acquisition, benefits administration, those types of things. Can even support separation of employment processes. So that's single source outsourcing. Then we have shared services or shared services centers. These terms typically refer to a consolidation of a business function within an organization or enterprise to a highly skilled internal department or group. An example might be all the administrative work is done by a shared services for all the departments in a company, or training is housed in a shared services environment. When the services offered by the shared services team are combined into a central operation, they often are the center that I refer to, the shared services center. When I was with Red Lion at one point, Red Lion was under the Hilton umbrella. And we switched from everybody handling benefits separately and every hotel doing their own benefits to having a shared services center that handled benefits. And again, a lot of us, that was hard for us to let go of that. I always loved benefits because that was an opportunity to really connect with employees. I still got to do that, but the employees just handled their benefits through basically a call center that handled all of that. So. And then the last one is, I don't have a lot of experience with these, but it's a PEO or a professional employer organization. This is an organization typically through a joint employer relationship that provides HR management and benefits to an employer's employees via, like I said, kind of a co-employer relationship. It doesn't have to be that, but usually it is. And most professional employer organizations kind of handle a lot of everything, from administration, workers' comp, regulatory compliance, things of that nature. And in essence, you're kind of leasing employees from them. So, a little side note, I don't have a lot of experience with professional employer organizations, but it is an option that's out there for you. So that is basically the presentation I did want to share with you, and you can have access, by the way. I believe you'll get access to a copy of the presentation. So I wanted to include some references for you here. The first one and the second one, everybody can get to, and you can just follow what I have there on the screen. The middle one, you do have to be a SHRM member to access that. So hopefully somebody in your organization maybe has a SHRM membership. That's the Society for Human Resource Management. And even if you're a small company and you don't have an HR professional in your company, I would offer up, it's not a bad idea to have a SHRM membership, or at least know where you can get information from SHRM. It is one of the experts out there nationwide is SHRM, great organization for HR information. So with that, we will open it up to any questions that we might have. I don't know if there have been any throughout the presentation, but.
That's exactly right. Thank you again, Krisann, for that excellent insight. If you do have questions for Krisann following that presentation, we still have time to answer those. You can submit those by just hitting the Q&A button and placing questions in there. We will prioritize those by upvote. So if you see a question, and you agree with it, hit that like button and we will make sure to prioritize that question. I did have a question in the meantime, though. One of the things that I know impacts a lot of small businesses is cost. So how much should a small business plan to budget if they are looking to outsource some of the services that you described?
Well, that's a fully loaded question you asked there, because it really just depends. Let me just give you an example though. The one platform that I was telling you about, 15.5, it's based upon the number of employees. So the smaller you are, the cheaper it'll be. The larger you are, the more expensive it'll be. But I think for us annually, I think we pay $10,000 for that, roughly. That's a guess, but that can give you a sense. Now, if you're a larger organization and you're looking at using the full-on package that ADP has to offer, you are looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars, and everywhere in between. And some of them too, some providers base it on their performance. So some of them, let me give you a couple of examples. Some of them can pay for themselves, like unemployment. You know, if you get a third-party provider that does a really good job with your unemployment processing, they can save you money. It actually pays for itself. Another good example of that is workers' compensation claims processing. We do that at Archbright, and through our retro program, again, we oftentimes return refunds to our members that participate in that. So, you know, it just depends and varies widely. So the best bet is to go through the strategy that I outlined there. And then when you start doing your homework and researching, you know, determining how much those are going to cost for you and your organization. And then hopefully you can be in a position to maybe include that in your budget for the upcoming year.
And since you went ahead and you mentioned the size of the business, how much of that matters as far as what should be outsourced versus what should be maybe handled in-house? Does the size of the business matter when it comes to some of those different services?
Well, I think it matters from the standpoint of expertise. You know, at Archbright, for example, we work with organizations that have one employee, and we work with organizations that have thousands of employees. That experience lends itself to, you know, the smaller organizations. It's, I will say, less common for them to have a lot of HR expertise. Now, a smaller organization also might not have to do all of those things. You know, if you're under 50 employees, there's some things on that list you don't have to do, right? So that helps you out there. But it's a little bit of a weird little balance, because the smaller you are, likely the less HR expertise you're going to have. You might have to pay a little bit more because you're outsourcing everything, right? Whereas a little bit larger organization, you might be paying internally to have an HR department. So you've got that cost to think about, but still have to outsource some of it because you don't have the expertise or the bandwidth. So, you know, I would say on that list, the smaller you are, the more likely you are to be outsourcing most of that stuff.
I also had a question about the HR vendor process and how you approach those. If you're a small business who's thinking about this, what should your first step be? Is it important to have that strategy already in place, or do you view kind of that first step more as a consultation? What does that process look like?
Most of them are really good about, you know, the consultative approach to that. I would say, from my experience, I mean, I like to be in a place where I really understand what it is I'm looking for, what, you know, go through that process that I outlined there, 1, 2, 3, 4. And that might not take very long, right? If I'm a small company, I'm going to have a pretty good sense of what expertise I have in-house, what my current state is, what my key initiatives are. So I might be in a really good place to then start looking at vendors. But let's say you decide, oh my gosh, I didn't even know I need to worry about leave administration. You might want to do some homework on leave administration before you start talking to a vendor, because one, you might not understand anything they're talking about. They may be talking about things that don't apply to you. Some leaves might apply to you, some might not, you know, that type of thing. So I think you need to do enough homework internally first, so you're in a really good position to get good information from that third-party provider. But then from there, I mean, you know, Ben, sometimes as a third-party provider for some of our members, I mean, sometimes they may make a decision like that. Sometimes it could take 2 years before a member decides they want to do their workers' comp claim processing through us, and everywhere in between. And we're very patient with our members and want to, help them as much as we can. So it just depends. It depends on the vendor, depends on the organization.
Based on the experience that you've had, what would you say is probably the most common HR activity that's outsourced for a lot of businesses?
I would say, if I was just to choose one, I would say payroll, benefits administration. Some of those, I would call them low-hanging fruit. They're things that have to be done, but honestly, it's really easier for someone with the expertise, the bandwidth, et cetera, to do it externally. So those things like payroll, benefits administration, unemployment claims processing, workers claims processing, affirmative action plans, some of those compliance issues that do require a lot of expertise, but they're kind of low-hanging fruit within your organization from the standpoint of what you're getting, outsource that. You don't want to be messing with that internally. You really don't.
And because we're in a pandemic, I feel like I have to ask about remote work. So are there any additional HR functions that come with remote employees that outsourcing can help with?
Yeah, yes. We have found internally with Archbright, because when COVID hit, we went 100% remote, and just now are starting to do a little bit of a hybrid model, getting back into the office. We're based out of Seattle. And so things like payroll and the ability to do everything online, benefits administration. We don't have just one single benefits, but we do have kind of a benefits portal that we use. And so thank goodness we had that when we went fully remote, so that employees can still access all of that. That 15.5 platform that we use, we were already starting into it before COVID hit. And it was like, oh my gosh, this has been an absolute blessing for us to have that when we went 100% remote, because we were still able to communicate, to engage, all of those types of things. So those are just a few examples that I can think of. Wellness programs that an outside provider can offer with a portal, those types of things, have been real blessings to have.
And before we close things out, we did get a question about Archbright and the services that you all provide, whether you offer consultations. I wanted to give you an opportunity to provide some background there if you could.
Yeah, so the answer to that question is absolutely yes. So we are an organization kind of like a Better Business Bureau, or kind of like a chamber, where in order to access our services, which are HR consulting services, you have to be a member. And through membership, you can then access our services. And we do everything from recruiting, organizational development. We do provide on-site HR consulting. So an organization that either is too small to have their own, or maybe they're in between, maybe somebody's on a leave of absence and you need an HR consultant. We do compensation design, we do succession, all those things basically on that first page. We do that all. We also have 5 staff attorneys, so we have employment law expertise, and your membership automatically gets you access to HR advice, expert advice, and legal expert advice. So that's a cool thing about our membership. And then, as I mentioned too, safety, loss control, and workers' compensation and claims processing. So yes, to answer that question, we do a lot of that through membership.
Krisann, I want to thank you again so much for sharing your insight with us and the small business owners that have tuned in today. Before I let everyone go, I did want to remind you all that today's webinar, it has been recorded and can be viewed on our BBB Great West and Pacific YouTube page. We'll also be sending out a link to the recording once it's available. Krisann has also been nice enough to share her slide deck that she shared today, so we will be including that as well. If you're interested in registering for one of our upcoming BBB webinars, you can do that. Just please visit our online events page at trust-bbb.org. I want to thank everyone again today for joining us. Have a great afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you again.